It's my pleasure here to be the first to greet you today. As many of you probably already know, our organization, New Leaders for Stability and Trust, began work as a group of young idealists under the name Creative Youth of Novi Sad as far back as 1996. At the time, we were focused on promoting democratic participation and youth trainings. Also, our main goal was to educate future leaders on the importance of Serbia's Euro-Atlantic integrations. Our task today, and the reason why we have such prominent experts taking part in this roundtable discussion, is to analyze a negative impact of fake news on forming objective opinion and viewpoints on Euro-Atlantic integrations of Serbia. Namely, recent research has shown that the youth in Serbia is predominantly opposed to Euro-Atlantic integrations. Now, whether this is justified or not, that is what exactly we are here to determine. When I say we, I mean our distinguished speakers today. In no particular order, we have Ms. Marija Vučić, journalist from Raskrikavanje, web portal, roughly translated and unmasking. Mr. Nikola Burazer, executive editor of European West Balkans portal. Mr. Zsolt Rabai, senior vice president of International Center of Development and Democratic Transition, Brussels-based expert with a vast experience in Euro-Atlantic integrations of Balkans. And Igor Novaković, research director of International and Security Affairs Center, ISAC. He's a bit late, but he will participate. This discussion will be moderated by my longtime co-activist, Ms. Ivana Stanišić-Bokić. I hope that everyone will find this discussion both useful and educational. Ivana, you have the stage.
Thank you, Milos. It is lovely to see you all today. I would like to start with one question for all the participants, because it is so broad. That topic that Milos has mentioned in his speech is that according to some researchers, 60% of young people in Serbia are against Serbia entering European Union, and even more, 80% of them are against Serbia joining NATO. However, 2/3 of the young people are thinking about moving from Serbia to one of the EU or NATO countries. Can we talk about that discrepancy? Why is it happening, and why do you think? What do you think that lies beneath that? Can we start with Mr. Rabai, and then we can go to Ms. Marija and Mr. Nikola? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. And I have to tell you that in the past many years, when we were seeing a lot of criticism against NATO and the European Union, we always put the question, but okay, you are very critical, you are very negative. Now, I'm not talking only about the Balkans, but also North Africa or the Middle East. So why all the people who are migrating, who are emigrating, who sees their future in danger in their home country, and they would see a brighter future somewhere else in the world, why most of those people actually are moving to the EU or to some of the NATO countries? Now, very difficult to answer this question. Probably this is partially a general mood, and also that people sees their issues and problems on 3 different levels. There is a personal level, there is the community level, and there is the national level. And probably on personal level, they sees their problems and issues in a better perspective in EU and NATO countries, and probably the national issues, what they can see, there they are more critical towards the EU and towards NATO.
Thank you. Marija, could you add something?
Yes, well, my opinion is on this topic is that actually people in Serbia maybe lost hope that we ever going to get into European Union, because this has been a long-lasting process of like joinment process, etc. And we actually people, for example, especially in the last few years, there is a common public opinion that EU is going to disappear, especially after Brexit, that EU is going to disappear before we actually enter European, is going to fall apart before we enter European Union. And when it comes to media reporting on this topic, and I have to mention one thing about NATO. It's not very, NATO is not popular in Serbia, which is a very logical thing, because we still have this collective trauma since 1999 and NATO bombing Serbia. And it's not popular, you know, like pursuing this idea of Serbia entering NATO. However, I would say that tabloids, for example, because I'm a journalist and I like to speak from this point of view, tabloids share, because all tabloids in Serbia are actually pro-governmental, they all share governmental point of view, and officially we want to become EU member. However, we do flirt on the other side with Russia and China, etc., like sitting on two chairs at the same time. And this is how tabloids report on this topic. Okay, we want to be a member of EU, but EU is always presented as a bit of an enemy for us, and the real friend of ours is actually Russia, etc. So it's a bit schizophrenic, like presentation of media of Russia on one hand and European Union on the other hand. So if you read tabloids in Serbia, you cannot get the actual picture of what would be our interests in this moment of time, what would be our interest to enter the European Union, what are possibilities, how would we benefit or not, etc. So it's a black-white picture. Okay, government wants to for us to become EU members, but on the other hand, we know that our love goes toward Russia and this Eastern Bloc. So that's the way they report, and I believe that people are all confused because of this kind of reporting. And on the other side, as I mentioned earlier, we have this experience of long-lasting process of entering EU, which is not ever going to end. It seems like this. So yeah, I would say that this lies in the background of the situation.
Thank you. I would like to hear Nikola also, and then I would go back because I have one more question regarding to something that you mentioned.
Okay.
Well, thank you. I mean, Marija already mentioned, I believe, most of the reasons for this lack of support to EU integration. But what I wanted to say is that primarily we should make a distinction between EU integration and Atlantic integration or NATO integration, even though these two processes were one the same at the beginning of Serbia's EU path, so in the beginning of the 2000s. But currently these are two completely separated processes, and definitely Serbia is at least theoretically progressing towards the EU, whereas it is claiming that it will never become a member of NATO. But I believe we can talk about NATO a bit later. Focusing on the European Union, certainly the reasons for this lack of support, or more important, lack of enthusiasm for EU membership. Because if you look at the numbers, you will see that a majority of the population, or somewhere around 50%, is constantly in favor of EU enlargement, so becoming a member of the EU. But what you cannot see in these polls is enthusiasm for the EU membership, and you can definitely see in different ways how this enthusiasm has basically reduced, and how citizens are less and less interested in EU membership as a goal. Now, there are different reasons for this. There are some, let's say, objective reasons, and some reasons that have to do with prevailing narratives coming from the government and the media. When it comes to objective reasons, certainly the problem is that this process seems to be never ending, like it has been going on for more than 20 years right now. And it will certainly take more than 5-6 years in the future, no matter what happens. And people simply lost trust in the process. They simply lost trust that it will ever be completed successfully. Also, the whole enlargement process kind of lost credibility in the past several years. Like, we are aware of very serious problems that we have with rule of law, state of democracy, media freedom, etc. And we are aware that criticism coming from the EU is sometimes weaker than it should be, because of the readiness of the Serbian government to engage in a dialogue with Kosovo. This is this famous policy of stabilitocracy, which you could see, but not only in Serbia. Citizens could easily see what's going on in other countries in the region. We can see North Macedonia and Albania not being open in negotiations, even after doing lots of reforms, especially North Macedonia, which changed its name merely because of launching accession negotiations. So the EU accession process has significantly lost credibility in the past several years, and it is visible to citizens of Serbia as well, and is also exploited by the Serbian media, especially pro-government media, which tends to portray the EU negatively. And there is certainly a very strong anti-EU propaganda in Serbia, and very strong anti-EU narratives coming from both the government officials and pro-government media. And this was especially visible since the beginning of the pandemic, when there was a very strong pro-Chinese campaign, very strong pro-Chinese rhetoric, even pro-Russian rhetoric, and a very strong negative anti-EU rhetoric. My organization has done some analysis of how media reported on the EU in 2020, and we could see that there's a very strong anti-EU campaign, where there were headlines such as "the EU would leave Serbs to die," "the EU put a ramp on Serbs," etc., etc. Whereas all the headlines about China were positive, with headlines such as "the love from China breaks your heart," that China will never leave Serbs alone, etc., etc. So you could basically see how there was a deliberate attempt to reduce the popularity of the EU, damage its image among the Serbian citizens. And we could see it had an effect, because if you look at recent polls on how the citizens perceive the help coming during the pandemic, the citizens perceive help coming from China as being the most important one, then Russia, and only somewhere far below, somewhere around only 5 to 10%, the European Union, even though the European Union was, as far as we know, the most important donor. So this campaign actually had an effect. Why do we see this campaign now? It's a bit of a complicated story. We could talk about it for hours, but we could say that on the one hand, the Serbian government tends to profit from being presented as being pro-Russian and pro-Chinese, because these countries are much more popular among their own electorate than the European Union or Western countries in general. And also another goal is to blunt criticism coming from Brussels, because if you have more and more criticism coming from the European Commission, from the European Parliament about the state of democracy and rule of law, then the best you can do, of course, is to blunt this criticism by saying, well, that the EU itself is not credible, that the EU itself is not benevolent, that it is not looking favorably upon Serbia's own interests. And this is what I believe has had an impact, and we can see it in these polls.
Yeah, that was exactly what I wanted to ask Marija, and what you mentioned, that it is perceived that China and Russia are the biggest helpers to Serbia, and EU is somewhere, as you said, far below. Of course, how media reporting on the situation helped that, and that is what we are discussing today: fake news. So, Marija, could you tell me what is the main inspiration for the fake news?
Well, when it comes to geopolitical actors in geopolitical area, I have to note that when we often talk about Russian propaganda and Russian influence over media, etc., I do not think that there is Russian propaganda in one sense. So we have Sputnik, for example, as state-funded media, which is not very popular in Serbia. We do not have huge media outlets that are like proliferating their propaganda. We do not need Russian propaganda. We don't need Russian state to invest some crazy amount of money to do a propaganda job here in Serbia, because Serbian people already like Russia in many ways, and narrative or our tabloids actually comply to this national sentiment that Russia is our friend and Russia is our bigger brother, and they were our allies in wars, and they are going to protect us from wars and coronavirus and everything. They're going to defend us. You see this blindly falling in love state with Russia in, for example, in articles about military cooperation, which is a very interesting thing. And I like to mention it on conversations like this. For example, you will see in domestic tabloids, for example, once in a month, that Russia is going to give us some kind of military equipment, helicopters, tanks, or weapons, whatever. And if you read only tabloids, you can get an impression that we have the only cooperation, military cooperation we have in the world with any country in the world is with Russia and China and Belarus as well. However, tabloids are not going to mention that actually we have very vivid cooperation with NATO members when it comes to joint military exercises or like commercial trade and donations, etc., because it's not popular. People do not want to read that we have cooperation, military cooperation with NATO, because we have like collective trauma, as I mentioned before, involving NATO from 1999, and actually an average Serbian reader does not want to see that we have cooperation with NATO. But that reader wants to see that we have cooperation with Russia, with China, with all those huge countries from Eastern Bloc that are going to protect us and defend us if necessary, etc. So in these topics, military and politics and vaccines, Nikola made some great remarks. Really, we were witnessing anti-EU propaganda during this COVID time, and Russia, China pro-favor propaganda, like they're going to give us vaccines, they're going to save us from everything, from coronavirus, from enemies, etc. So as I mentioned before, you have this, there is one really simplified black and white picture of the world in Serbian media, because there is like commercial interest in this, because, for example, the owner and the editor of Informer, which is the biggest and most influential tabloid in Serbia, very pro-governmental. He, in some interview for Politico a few years ago, said that Putin actually sells, Putin on front pages sells newspapers. People like to see Putin on front page. So there's a commercial interest in this, and there's ideological paradigm, I would say, that complies with national sentiment. People like to see and like to confirm their attitude towards Russia, and like to confirm their prejudice for Russia, that Russia is our friend and Putin is our friend and brother, big brother, and China as well. So in fact, European Union is often presented as something that we want to be a member of, but
not really.
Not really. Yeah, it's they're like they have their own interests, which are not the same as ours. It's different culture, many things like LGBT and all the other things that we don't like come from the West, and it's like obscure, like is something that is obscure in our newspaper. We officially want to be member state, but not really. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Rabai, what is the public opinion on European and Euro-Atlantic integrations in other CE countries that have like more than 15 years of experience with EU and NATO? Can you tell us more about that?
Thank you very much for the floor, because the discussion is going into a direction which is really raising lots of different issues and questions. And somewhere I can see some parallels with other Central Eastern European countries. For example, what we could see on different public opinion polls, most recent public opinion polls, that the Visegrad countries, for example, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary, people in those countries, and especially young people in those countries, they position their countries as Central Europe, so in between the West and the East. And this was quite a surprise. Only Hungarian youth in between the age of 18 and 24 was actually defining the position of Hungary more as a Western country than a Central European, but the two numbers were almost the same. But what is interesting, that despite the fact that we, and I can tell also about myself, we managed to keep our Central European identity, there is a very strong support of the EU membership. And even now, I don't know how much you follow the Hungarian internal politics and external politics, but you know the ruling party Fidesz and the Hungarian government is also very critical towards the European Union, and it's rather friendly with Russia and China. Despite this fact, 77% of the Fidesz voters are favorable for EU membership, and they see the positive impact of being inside the European Union. Now, I think that what is, on the other hand, quite interesting, that the support for the European Union is higher than in the old EU countries. However, when there was the question raised, how much you think your country can influence the European Union and EU decision-making, then just of a sudden, the old EU countries, the voters, I mean people, public opinion says, oh yes, very high, over 70, 80% in Denmark, Netherlands, Germany, Sweden. But immediately in Hungary, for example, it was 55%. So what is an interesting situation, that people still, after more than 15 years being in those institutions, see those institutions as they. We are here, and EU and NATO is they. They are there. And okay, it's good to be in. We have a lot of benefit from being in, but still, I think that people did not realize that making decisions, for example, in NATO, is by consensus. If the Hungarian government says no, if the Slovak government says no, there is no NATO operation, there is no NATO decision. But still, for people, no, we have very little impact. Oh yes, those countries have huge impact, because they can anytime block any decision inside NATO, but also the same with the EU, though in some issues there is a majority decision making, but still your government has an important vote and can actually represent very well in this mechanism the interest of your own country. Now, there is an other issue, and why governments do not really like what I see now. Saying this, yes, there are lots of things that we could improve in the EU and the work of the Commission, and less bureaucracy and more efficient and so forth, undoubtedly. But what is now the main issue? Really the main issue that once you join the EU, there are criteria and you have to apply those criteria. It is not only the financial support and economic support, but you have political criteria, economic criteria, legal criteria, and also security criteria. So if your country is unable or not willing to apply those criteria, for example, the anti-corruption measures or transparency or democratic institutions that are working really, because it's quite funny saying it is not enough to have democratic institutions on place, but the formula is that they are on place and they are working and they are functioning. And in some situations, I have a feeling that now some of our governments do not really like this, and they try to present it as a foreign intervention. No, it is not, because once you entered, you accepted the rules of the club. Once you accepted the rules of the club, please play according to the rules. If you don't play according to the rules, the club and the leadership of the club will criticize you that, please guys, do what you promised to do.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you one more thing. Looking from outside, how far do you think Serbia is right now of being integrated?
This is very interesting question. What I see that now in the European Union, but both in NATO, one of the major issue is internal consistency and unity. And I have a feeling that now there is not big appetite of the countries to bring in further member states, especially if those member states are already now very critical towards the EU or towards NATO, because they think that they will bring in additional disputes and discussions, and that would actually doesn't help. That would not help the strengthening the unity of those organizations or of the alliance. But this is my very personal opinion and the conclusion what I see now.
Thank you. Nikola, I would like to ask you, can we just go short on what are the biggest benefits of Serbia joining EU and Serbia joining NATO? So as we mentioned, that not many young people are for EU and Euro-Atlantic integrations. However, they want to live in some of the EU countries. So first benefit would be if you join EU, you can move pretty much wherever you want. But what are the other benefits of Serbia joining EU and NATO?
Yeah, well, I'd just like to address what Marija talked about before, and this is this pro-Russian propaganda. And I just wanted to agree with her that basically, according to her own research, Sputnik is not that relevant when it comes to pro-Russian propaganda in Serbia. Of course, it is relevant to a degree in the sense that there are many pro-Russian media which rely on Sputnik, but in the mainstream, you can find Sputnik only there where these media which republish Sputnik's content actually want to have a pro-Russian content on the website, which kind of puts the responsibility on this particular media and not on Sputnik as the main source of information. And sometimes I say even that even if Russia did not exist, we would invent it, because this is how, you know, the pro-government media in Serbia are reporting about Russia. And no true cooperation is even needed to have pro-Russian propaganda in the Serbian media, because the Serbian government benefits from it, and even the opposition, some parts of the pro-Russian opposition benefit from it as well. So you basically see Russia being having quite a strong presence in Serbia, even without its own meddling. And of course, it also has some impact, but this is not the main problem. When it comes to your question now, well, if you ask people what is the main benefit of EU accession, they will certainly tell you you can travel with your passport to any EU member state and live there. This is something quite palpable. This is something that a majority, let's say, of young people in Serbia would like to have. Many people actually do that. They actually go and live in EU member states. So giving the opportunity to go and more easily go and live there is something that they truly feel that they can benefit from. But of course, it's a wrong way to look at EU membership. I mean, there are ways to live even now and live in a EU member state. This is not the reason why we should advocate for EU accession. The whole idea should be to make our own country look more like EU member states, to look at more like a country where people would like to go and live, and not a country where people would run away from to live in some other countries. Now, of course, it is quite hard to explain what would be the benefits, because it is quite complex, because it is not just a matter of you enter the EU and then all your problems are solved. This is how many people imagine EU accession. Then they look at some other countries which joined the EU in recent years, so Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia, and then they say, well, you know, it didn't really turn out like paradise after they joined. But this is not the point. We cannot become paradise after joining the EU, but we can have much stronger financial benefits. That is the most palpable thing at the beginning. But you also need to apply certain standards that are impacting your everyday life, from certain standards of environmental protection, to improve the rule of law, to having access to some rights which you do not have currently at the moment. And basically all areas of life are expected to be improved during the very progress towards the European Union, so aligning your standards with the EU standards. And then in the end, when you become a full member state, then basically you enjoy certain rights, you enjoy certain financial gains, because your country then has a lot more funds at its disposal than EU candidate country. And then, of course, it is something that all citizens of Serbia will benefit from. But it is, you know, not that palpable in the sense that you can say somebody, well, tomorrow you will join, and then in 2 days you will have this and that. And therefore, all of these benefits are not that clear to the citizens. And the clearest thing there is, of course, the passport. You get EU membership, and then tomorrow you can leave. You can live in Finland, you can live in Ireland, you can live anywhere without much paperwork, without much restrictions. You can choose where you want to work. And especially those young people who actually migrated abroad and who have a hard time finding employment, getting all those necessary documents and visas, would really feel, you know, like tomorrow benefits if Serbia would become EU member states. But as I said, it's a wrong way of looking at it, because that is something that is directed towards migrating from Serbia, and it's an individual benefit, not the benefit of the society. And there are these other benefits for the society, which I have mentioned. And now, of course, the problem is, how do you explain to people? How do you make this whole process closer to the citizens? How to make them understand that the very process of EU accession is a process of improving your country, not only going to to reach this one goal of membership, but also improving your country in every possible way. And this is now, because the EU accession process is very technical. You have these chapters, you have these action plans, you have these measures, but most citizens do not understand what a chapter is. They don't understand what an action plan is. Why is it important for them? And this is now where the civil society, the media should do their job to explain this better to the citizens, and that would not only improve the support for EU accession, but also improve the role of the citizens within the EU accession process. But of course, our work is hindered by these campaigns against the EU in the mainstream media and pro-government media, because they tend to portray the accession process as a set of blackmails, as a set of pressures against Serbia, where the things we do not do for ourselves, but we do because others want us to do that. And here primarily I refer to the issue of Kosovo, which is something which is undoubtedly something where we are expected to do something which we would otherwise not do, like engage in a dialogue with Kosovo. But this is only one of the parts, one of the elements of the accession process. The Serbian government tries to portray it as the most important problem, like everything else is actually super fine, even a rule of law is fine, only Kosovo is there as a problem, and once we resolve it, we will become EU member states tomorrow. But this is not how we should communicate EU accession process, because the democratization process is only one part of it, and the problems in other areas such as rule of law, basic political Copenhagen criteria such as state of democracy are much more important for the citizens of Serbia. And in my honest opinion, they're a much bigger obstacle for EU membership of Serbia than the issue of Kosovo.
Just a second, we would like to let Igor in. He will be joining us. And then I have one more question for you, because as I asked Mr. Rabai, how does it look from the outside? How close are we? And now I would like to hear from you, how does it look from the inside? Are we really, really far? Because you said it's perceived as Kosovo is the only issue, and there are actually many, many others. How closer are we now that we were like 20 years ago? For example, let's put it that way.
Well, 20 years ago, we were nowhere. Now we are somewhere. So definitely we made some progress. But if you compare the situation now with the situation of like 5, 6, 7 years ago, I would say we are farther away now from membership than we were these 7, 8 years ago, which is paradoxical because we made some formal progress in opening some chapters. I mean, the latest one was opened in 2019, so 2 years now we are basically stuck in place. But in reality, we're moving backwards, because the fundamental requirement for EU membership is having a democratic country and having appropriate level of rule of law, have some standards which are necessary to join the European Union. And we are moving further away from that. The political situation in the country is getting more and more complicated. And this is not something that bodes well for the continuation of our EU path. And no matter how many chapters we might have opened or closed, well, basically we closed only 2, which is not really a success, but we did open more than half of the chapters. But it doesn't really mean anything unless there is a democratic society, a country which is devoted to the goal of EU accession, which is ready to undergo all necessary reforms, and which is genuinely interested in having this country become a member of the European Union with all the standards it requires. My impression is we do not have that at the moment, and therefore, mathematically speaking, maybe we are somewhere halfway or close to being halfway, but in reality, right now, we are nowhere. We are also stuck in this EU accession process as we were 10, 15 years ago.
Thank you. Mr. Rabai, you would like to comment on something that Nikola said, right?
Yeah, thank you very much for the floor. Actually, I was working a long time ago on Hungary's EU accession. And I remember at that time all the illusions that the Hungarian society had. What I can tell you that EU accession, that can give you a lot of opportunities, a lot of support, financial support, standards, but this is competition. And this is something that people forget, that once you are exposed to the common market and to EU, you have the opportunities, but you can also lose because you are in a competition. You get a lot of support for being able to cope with the pressure, but still this is a competition. Now, after more than 15 years, let me to mention to you, there was a public opinion poll in Hungary. It was just in 2019. And the question was, what does it mean for you, the European Union? And that might help a little bit to explain what it is actually, partially, at least what is the feeling of people. The first and most important subject that people mentioned, and actually they were free to mention anything, so there were no predefined subjects. That was the support, financial support, and economic development. This was mentioned by most of the people. Second one, due to the actual political talks, migration. Then the third one is community. The fourth issue was Schengen. That means free movement, practically, followed by being able to work abroad. And then institutions of the European Union, welfare, it was mentioned, but only 5% of the people. Okay, the first topic was mentioned by 16%, so that was the difference. The European values is quite behind, it is only 3%, and the common market is also 2.9% of the people who mentioned. Corruption, it is even lower, but that means if they associate the EU with corruption or with anti-corruption measures, seemingly people do not do so. Bureaucracy, Brexit, and control, but those last three things were around 1% of the answer. So most important, support, financial support, economic development, then migration, then community, free movement to work abroad. And those were the most important topics that were mentioned by Hungarians after more than 15 years inside the European Union.
Thank you. I would like to give floor now to Igor, if you are all settled now. And I would like to start with you with a question. Why is there no local ownership in Serbia when it comes to benefits of the European Atlantic cooperation?
Well, first, thank you for the invitation. And it is a real pleasure and privilege to be with you today. So let's speak first about not just European, but Euro-Atlantic. So, of course, reasons are in the legacy of bombing, and which is still by the current ruling elite back in the already back in the days when they were in opposition decade ago. So basically, NATO was, and the issue of cooperation with NATO for years was the sitting duck, and especially after the proclamation of independence of Kosovo in 2008. I think that NATO has been blamed for everything. On one hand, so I think that this approach spilled over years until now. So every day in the media and especially in the tabloids, you can see this constant attacks on NATO, on their secret plans and wishes. I mean, I think that the reality is much more complex, and that many of those titles are nowhere near the truth. But that being said, apart from that, of NATO being a sitting duck for the majority of tabloids and parts of the ruling elite, there is also a realistic approach. I think that our elite is aware that without a solution for the issue of Kosovo, we cannot become the member of NATO because NATO does not accept countries with territorial disputes. Historically, I think there was only one example that they did so, but that was in the end, at the beginning, the very reason for the existence of NATO. They accepted the membership of the Western Germany. But then it was a Cold War, and right now NATO does not want to be involved in any territorial dispute, and that is why Serbia, despite all the bombastic announcements, secret wishes of NATO, etc., is not able to become a member. But then again, there is also a question. But what about the good sides of cooperation with the alliance? through the Program of Partnership for Peace, and Serbia is a member of this program since 2007. What about the concrete benefits of this cooperation? Why the ruling elite, why the media are not emphasizing that? And yet again, I think that there is also this, memory of and the legacy of 1999 bombing, which is constantly stirred up by the both ruling elite and also tabloids and certain TV stations with the national frequency. Then there is also one more thing which is important to mention, and that is the question of cooperation with Russia. So for Russia, cooperation with NATO is not really something that should be that is desirable. Serbia, from its side, I think it's very aware that Russia does not offer any real strategic alternative. We can talk about that later. But since Moscow is needed for until the issue of Kosovo is finally resolved from the standpoint of Serbia, then they do not want to provoke too much Russia in a sense, and to emphasize the benefits of cooperation. And we could see actually as a proof of what I was saying. So for a number of years, we have a liaison office of NATO within the Ministry of Defense. 2 or 3 years ago, I think, Russia posed a demand to open its own liaison office in the Ministry of Defense, which basically has no sense, because their argumentation is, if NATO can, then we can too. And of course, this puts the government of Serbia in my view, I don't have any precise information about it, but it has put it in a problematic situation when it comes to further cooperation with NATO. But to conclude, from one side, it is really hard for the government, for the ruling elite, to emphasize and promote this cooperation, although it exists in reality, and the results are significant. On the other hand, it is not quite popular because of the legacy, and also, there is this misuse of NATO as a topic, because quite rarely, we could see NATO officials from the alliance to come and to defend publicly NATO here in the discourse. We had several years ago a statement from the General Secretary of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who in a sort of way apologized for the innocent victims of the NATO bombing, but that was nowhere enough, I guess, for the public in Serbia to start reacting differently. Still, I think that there is a chance to improve this, and I will just give you one example. In 2005, in official opinion polls, more than 35% of citizens of Serbia back then, and that was before the proclamation of independence of Kosovo, supported Serbia's NATO membership. So without any campaign, without anything. So if the situation changes vis-a-vis Kosovo, maybe we could experience a different attitude. And I'm not talking about the integration first. I'm talking about the positive attitude about the cooperation with NATO.
Yeah, that was exactly my next question, is about the public opinion. We have to address that, and Marija already mentioned. So Marija, the next question is for you. You already mentioned the collective trauma that we have from the 1999. Do you think there is a way to overcome that, and what can be done so the public opinion changes in Serbia? Do you see it changing anytime soon? And if you do, how?
Well, I do not see it changing anytime soon, and I really do have a lot of understanding for this national sentiment towards NATO. But as I see, the role of media is not to comply to the sentiment, but to report on certain topics, on all topics actually, objectively and unbiased and impartial, because if we let us journalists, this sentiment and this trauma lead us, we are very keen to reporting on a certain subject that is important for us, subjectively and with a lot of emotions, which could be understanding for people. You know, during NATO bombing, people actually died and families were, you know, like destroyed. And it's been 20 years since then. I do not expect, since those generations are alive, that we could like forget this just like that. But the media have a different role. Okay, let people have their feelings about this, but let media explore this NATO and all the other topics in an objective and cold, I would say, cold manner, because we, as Nikola, while talking about EU accession process, he actually made, I have to say once again, great remarks, because, for example, EU is presented in Serbia, and this is like an example of how media report not objectively about important topics, including NATO. Well, when it comes to European Union, there is a European Union is perceived here in Serbia as boring parent, too demanding parent that has its some nonsense formal requirements we have to fulfill, and this is the way media report on this. They are going to report on chapters open or closed, and who was on a meeting with whom, etc. And they're not going to touch the essence of the accession talks. And this is how these accession talks actually can and are making us, this whole accession process, is this making us better in terms of corruption, fighting against corruption and freedom media and rule of law and judicial independency, etc. Are we making any progress in this process or not? So this is the essence, which media are completely blind to this side of the story. And this is the same thing with NATO. Okay, we are being led with our feelings. We are not going to report objectively on NATO. Whatever topic we are reporting on, we are not going to report objectively, because we know what the feedback is going to be, and people do not want to. You know, you cannot mention in Serbian to Serbian public that the high rate of cancer among children has nothing to do, or not much things to do, with NATO bombing, which actually the official statistics shows that there is no high rate of children cancer in the last 20 years. But there's this perpetually, how I would say, NATO propaganda. Every year you have reports in Serbian media that thanks to NATO bombs, our children are dying 20 years afterwards. And we published an article actually that from official health institutions that shows the statistics that shows that it's more or less the same as 20 years ago. I mean, cancer rate among children, and people were very angry after that article, because they were expecting this kind of they weren't expecting this kind of article and this kind of statistics that actually goes against their own views on NATO, etc. So these are very controversial topics, and media have additional responsibility when reporting on this. Okay, I do not want to provoke people. I do not want to minimize their pain, but I have to bring them truth. This is my job. So I don't see things are going to change in any future, sooner future, but nevertheless, journalists have to, work professionally so that this attitude maybe one day is going to be changed. Not sure.
Yeah, when you mentioned that, there was a research that has shown that percentage of people that have cancer in Serbia is somewhere in the middle when it comes to Europe, but the percentage of deaths among cancer patients is way higher than the average in the Europe. So do you think that is the reason, it is easier to find someone to blame for high percentage of cancer than to focus on what the actual problem is, and that is how to work on your health system in order to, when discovered, cancer is treated, and that we don't have such a high rate of deaths from cancer?
Well, maybe on the other hand, we have a huge problem with heart diseases. For example, in Serbia, I think Serbia is first or the second in Europe when it comes to deaths related to heart diseases, and we're not addressing this problem in any way functional. But I would say that here the problem is different. The problem is one common psychological fact is that you as a person, you rather search and believe to content that confirms your attitudes than to, we do not like to be confronted. We do not like to read the content that actually challenges our attitudes. Okay, I believe that it's NATO's fault for this cancer rate and everything in my country. And I like to read content that confirms this point of view. And I dislike content that actually challenges this view. So it's a psychological fact, but it's very misused by domestic tabloids.
Yeah, it is the same with anti-vax propaganda. And when we mentioned that, Mr. Rabai, how are the Western institutions dealing with that public opinion? Do they use like thought-out communication, or they're using propaganda?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And let me to add a few things to the conversation that we had before. Just some little notes from my professional life. I worked as a diplomat, then I worked also for 18 years in NATO, working in communication issues at the Public Diplomacy Division. And I can tell you one thing. When I worked as a diplomat before joining NATO, I was a Hungarian diplomat. And the civil war in the former Yugoslavia started. I was shocked when I heard some Western colleagues, when they expressed their very strong support to Serbia, because Serbia was the Western world's main ally, was considered as the main ally of the Western world because of its role in the Second World War. And me as a Hungarian, of course, we lost the Second World War. So I was shocked. I said, my God, so many decades after the Second World War, the political thinking in Europe is still so much influenced. And from this position, I'm mentioning this because from this position, unfortunately, Milosevic managed to turn totally the political atmosphere inside Europe up to the NATO intervention. And when we hear always mentioning the NATO bombing, I can fully feel the sadness, the problems, the tragedy. But the conflict didn't start with NATO bombing. The conflict actually, at least the armed conflict, ended by NATO bombings. And I think it is also important to see, but this is an opinion from the outside world. Now, how NATO and EU are dealing with those issues. Just one very short story. When I worked at the Public Diplomacy Division, and Public Diplomacy Division in NATO was dealing also with media and press and with public relations. We had very often political pressure, that we should rather use propaganda. So let's shape a little bit the news. Let's shape a little bit what we are communicating, that it looks more positive than the reality. Sometimes we had huge pressure from the military, because they said, guys, what you are doing doesn't fit the info operations and the psyops, the psychological operations in the theaters. Please transform, do it accordingly. And we said, no way. What we are doing is communicating the facts, at least what we know the best, that those are the facts, and we refuse to lie. And there was a very practical reason. We had many journalists working with us, I mean, at NATO Public Diplomacy Division, and they said, look, guys, once the Western media will realize, and they will realize after a while, that we were lying, we lose credibility for decades. It will be very difficult to get it back. So what I can tell you, that really the best intention of the communication team, for example, is NATO, is to try to reflect the facts. And you can also find on the internet fact sheets where they try to put all the real facts, the data, for example, NATO-Russia relations, when, what happened, and what was the agreement between NATO and the Russian government. So this is somewhere the way they try to work. I think that there is a weakness of the communication, but all big institutions have this weakness. This is social media, because working on social media sites, you need to be present 24 hours a day, and there are not enough people to do this on behalf of, for example, of NATO or the EU. Now, there will be, I think that we could continue then later on a discussion on fake news, disinformation, how we were dealing with this, and how the EU and NATO was working with this, because there immediately we go towards the Russian active measures and the other hybrid attacks against the Western world. But I don't want to go into the details now, because that would be a too wide and too large topic.
Thank you. Nikola, what do you think, who is mostly opposing the European and Euro-Atlantic integration? Does it seem to you like very, very young people, most of them were not even born in the 1999, that they are the biggest opposers to Serbia joining EU and NATO?
Well, the polls certainly show that young people are much more Eurosceptic, and this could be explained by various reasons. One probably is that they grew up in a world where EU accession is a mainstream. So since the day they know about themselves, we've been on this road towards the EU. And in that sense, they cannot really remember. They don't know what happened before that, what happened in Serbia in the 90s. What did we move away from? Why did we even start this process? What kind of society we lived in, and how much we have actually progressed in these past 20 years, regardless of where we are, let's say, when it comes to the accession process, where we are as a society is definitely lots of steps forward. The young people are not really aware of that, and therefore they're much more susceptible to propaganda. One part of the propaganda is this propaganda which I have spoken about earlier, and this is propaganda directed against the European Union. And the second problem is that there is a lot of propaganda here about the 90s and about the period coming immediately after the 90s. We now live in a society where there's been some kind of rehabilitation of the regime from the 90s and their actions and this whole narrative that the decline of Serbian economy and Serbian society somehow began after 2000, so after 5th October. Of course, those of us who are a bit older do remember the 90s. We do know when did this fall actually took place, but younger generations have no recollection of this period. So therefore, they're much more susceptible to propaganda. And this is why I believe that they hold these stances. And of course, you know, being young is usually being against the mainstream, somehow being provocative, being against the mainstream. As I mentioned, young people in Serbia, for them, EU accession is the mainstream. They know about it since the day they were born. It's a never-ending process. And therefore, I believe that they somehow show their protest to the society they see around themselves, with economic poverty, inequality, and all the problems we are faced with. They somehow put the blame on the EU accession as a process which somehow has something to do with it. And of course, then the EU's own position, the EU's own rhetoric isn't really helpful, because when you have high EU officials praising Serbian reforms, praising Serbia's path towards the EU, then of course young people are going to somehow recognize that the EU is somehow supportive of everything which they see around themselves, and then put the blame on the EU. And of course, they're not the only ones. Older people also put the blame on the EU, but older people do remember what happened earlier, what the EU was in this country during the 90s and during the 2000s, and therefore they're much less susceptible to this kind of attitude change. But young people, I mean, they are a problem. Like, what can we expect in the next 10 years if young people are Eurosceptic, if they're more nationalist than the older generations? That is a question we should all ask ourselves.
Thank you. Igor, what do you think? How to improve the public discourse and how to present it better to the youth?
Regarding the public discourse, I mean, first and foremost, I think that we need the right advocacy strategy, not just when it comes to the Euro-Atlantic integration process, but also the EU integration process. Both coming from the alliance and the EU, and from the government. The point is, as Nikola already said, it's not just about the support, for example, that the EU institutions or NATO or whomever is giving to the reform-oriented process in Serbia. It's also about having NATO and also to some extent the EU as a scapegoat for everything that is happening in this country. So nobody's emphasizing that we are doing certain reforms because of ourselves, that we are cooperating NATO because of ourselves, that we are doing certain steps within the process of the integration because of ourselves. I think that Mr. Rabai said something about the perceptions of citizens of Hungary during the integration process, and even there you can see that what was emphasized is the economic progress, application of certain standards, but what about also about interest, about the reform of society. So what we need, in fact, to improve this public discourse, first and foremost, is the responsibility of the ruling elite, their own enticing of the local ownership, so that they accept these processes as their own, and that we are doing that to improve our system, the position of citizens. And then with that, instead of blaming somebody or using EU, NATO, or whomever as a scapegoat, then we could have, a long-term a stepping stone for long-term improvement of the public image, both of NATO and the EU and other connected institutions. So instead of just, I fully agree with each and every decent commemoration regarding victims of NATO bombing, of wars. I think it's our duty to do that. But it would be also really productive to really try for all of these commemorations to have some dignity, and from there also to emphasize different aspects, of what are our current policies, what are our current interests, where do we want to go, and from that, highest officials of the state should emphasize certain elements of importance regarding cooperation both with the EU and NATO. And then we come to the youth. Of course, as Nikola said, youth are usually opposed to what are the mainstream policies, but then again, there is a number of ways to involve them. So until now, what we have seen are only different media, CSOs, and independent institutions starting programs regarding on educating or presenting information about what Marija, I think, described as what is truth. So let's educate people about the reality on terrain, about our interests, but it will be also really productive that these efforts are not just limited to the independent institutions, media, and civil society organizations. It would be also worthwhile to have state-owned institutions, education system, etc. That would, in essence, that would really contribute to a sort of paradigm shift like this. All of these institutions that are independent institutions that I mentioned are just keeping the flame alive, which is also important in certain sense.
Thank you. Mr. Rabai, you mentioned social media in your previous answer, so I would like to ask you now, how does social media actually reflect the public opinion concerning EU and NATO cooperation in CE countries? Are there any visible difference, manipulations, etc.?
Social media, I think it's a very timely topic, because we know already that social media is extremely important. That's a very important tool, especially in those countries where the media is mainly in the hand of the governments, and the opposition's almost only way of expressing opinion is social media and the internet. On the other hand, social media can be weaponized and can be really used for undermining trust in institutions, in governments, undermining trust in processes, in the whole vaccination process, for example, that we could see recently. And really, I think that what would be the most important, that we also, not only the young people, I think that young people might even know better how to use social media, but everybody who is using social media learn how to find out whether an information is reliable or not reliable. And this is something that I think we should really teach to everybody. There are very simple methods how you can decide whether a news is probably reliable or not reliable, whether the source is reliable or not reliable. But definitely social media should be dealt with. Now, we had recently in ICDT a research on certain social media discussions. It was specifically on national security. And what we had to realize, that social media doesn't reflect public opinion, social media debates. But social media debates influence public opinion. So they are extremely important, but be careful. Don't make a false conclusion when you are reading the comments or you are following some social media debates, because they might definitely not reflect the real public opinion from different psychological reasons, also from the reasons that not everybody is active on social media debates, but they are very influential. Now, again, I think that in our further discussions we should a little bit deal more deeply with social media issues. I don't want to take now the time because we are running out of time.
Yeah, we will discuss that in the next week. Yeah.
Yes, I don't want to abuse your patience, but I'm looking forward for the discussion on social media issues.
Me too. Marija, Mr. Rabai mentioned the media literacy as the very important thing. What do you think is the recipe in dealing with the fake news? What do you think is media literacy the answer, like educating people in that area, and how we should do it? Marija is.
Sorry, when it comes to media literacy and resistance to fake news in general, I would say that, of course, we have to include schools and educational system in this fight against fake news, because there is no media literacy as a course in Serbian schools. I don't believe there is, maybe as like a faculty for the students who want to listen this course. But I don't think it's something that we necessarily have to include in raising media literacy level in general. But the thing we have to address is, of course, politics, because politicians have to learn finally that media and journalists are not supposed to be the instrument in their political fight. And they are here to answer our questions, not hiding from us and attacking us. But I would say that the core thing when it comes to media literacy is media themselves. We have a problem with corruption in media. And by that, I mean editors and journalists who accepted working unprofessionally for smaller or bigger benefits. They accepted to breach professional rules and to intentionally spread lies. And that is the thing that is the most dangerous thing in our how would say when it comes to journalistic society, journalistic milieu in a way. We journalists, as journalists, we have to address this problem among ourselves. We should stop, blaming politicians and businessmen putting pressure on us. We should do this because they are really putting pressure on us. However, we have to look into ourselves and ask ourselves whether we are honest and professional or not. And as long as we have journalists and editors who are available for and who do not want to resist pressures and who are going to publish lies in favor of someone's interests, we are going to have lies in public space spread by professional media and media outlets. This is the problem. As long as we do not have journalists who are not ashamed of lying, we are going to have a problem with media literacy, because people are not going to know what media should we believe or not. So this is I think the core thing in this problem: media honesty on the first place, journalistic honesty and integrity in the first place, and then of course educational system, politics, etc.
Thank you. We are approaching the end, so I have one more question for all of you that I would like to ask you to be short. We will start with Nikola. The intro would be: does the real cooperation with NATO, for example, corresponds with the perception of NATO in domestic media outlets? And once you respond to that, I would like a short answer from all of you. What are your suggestions to have the real picture painted in the Serbian media, not just on this topic, but when it comes to fake news in general?
Well, it does not correspond at all. I mean, as we all know, Serbia enjoys a pretty good partnership with NATO, which is frequently commended by NATO officials and also by by the officials of the Serbian government. So this cooperation is both in military and civilian terms, and basically this is something that is completely absent from the public discourse. If you look at the mainstream media, you will get the impression that Serbia and NATO are almost on the brink of war, that NATO is arming Serbia's enemies, and they're always scheming to somehow hurt Serbian interests. And if you want to insult somebody in the Serbian public discourse, you accuse him or her of being close to NATO or in liaison with NATO. And this goes for both the government and the opposition, which somehow shows what kind of image there is of NATO in the Serbian public. But cooperation is there in practice. Even when it comes to military exercises, there is much more attention to military exercises that exist with the Russian Federation than with NATO and NATO member countries, even though there are much more exercises done with NATO. This is something that I'm sure that not many Serbian citizens are aware of. So this is something that I believe is in a way a reflex of the conflicts of the 90s, the role of NATO, and of course NATO bombing in 99, but also the general role of NATO in Kosovo's declared independence and the whole Kosovo issue. But it also due to there being, I believe, political interests to portray NATO negatively, because the Serbian political elites do not really want to be seen as in friendly terms with NATO. And this is why we have this image which nobody is really trying hard to change. Now, NATO officials are always pointing at this problem that, one of the elements of the IPAP, so this individual partnership action plans that Serbia has with NATO, is public diplomacy. So Serbian officials should publicly recognize this partnership and the benefits that Serbia gets from this partnership. And this has always been labeled as a problem because the Serbian officials are not vocal enough and the media are not really reporting enough about this. And the overall image of NATO is quite negative, and officials do really nothing to change that. And this is definitely something that could potentially hurt Serbia-NATO cooperation in the future. Of course, the question is how much can NATO itself turn a blind eye to this, and how much do they actually care about their own image? My impression is that they start to care much more than they used to, and this is going to be a topic in the coming years. Now, what to do? I mean, I don't think that it is a job of media to promote NATO, regardless of what the editorial position might be. What has to be done is that there should be reporting about what is actually going on in Serbia-NATO partnership, which in practice exists. It is improving when it comes to the exact numbers, and this is something that media should report on. And then, of course, there is always going to be these narratives about the NATO bombing, and the scars are going to be there. I mean, not whatever we might say or do, but this is something completely separate from what is the existing cooperation between Serbia and NATO today, and the media should just objectively report about that, putting all these other issues aside. And I believe that will be enough to fulfill this requirement from IPAP, and to gradually change the perception of NATO. Because if you are constantly bombarded every day with news about NATO being the enemy, then of course the image is going to be very, very bad. But if citizens are aware, for example, of these military exercises, the benefits of Serbian scientists from NATO programs, etc., then gradually we might see a change in this perception.
Thank you. Mr. Rabai, could you respond to the same question, please?
I see. I have several points to raise. I try to be very, very short. First, changing public opinion in a country probably would be very difficult without the active leading role and participation of the local politicians and government. So changing public opinion against the people who have authority inside the country, who are the elected officials, might be possible, but very difficult. Now, given the fact that most people those who are the most open, they would say, yeah, maybe I don't believe this propaganda, but NATO is also doing propaganda. I don't really believe what they are saying. I would encourage very much the organization and support of fact-checking NGOs, those independent people who are really good in checking whether something, some accusations, some numbers are factual or false. There are already many around the world, and they are doing an immense and incredibly important job. So I would definitely encourage this. Now again, with young people, I think that the best way of convincing young people, I agree, we should not promote anything. We should not convince anybody. We should convince them about believing the facts. So I think that this is the most important. People young people should be actively involved into programs where they can work and search for the facts. And then once they have the facts, they can decide whether they like or they dislike. Again, back in my professional history, I was in a country, I don't want now to tell exactly which one, where I had a discussion with young people and they said, oh, we love NATO, you are really our best friends. And I said, okay, guys, let me to tell you everything about NATO. They were before joining the alliance. And then I told them what NATO was. And they said, really? So then we should join maybe some operations, maybe we should do this, we should do that. Yeah, I'm a little bit hesitant now. And I said, I'm really happy. This was one of the most successful discussion of my job, because maybe less people loved NATO or had positive opinion, very positive, but at least those who really said, yes, I'm still supportive, they knew why, and they knew what it was indeed, and their decision was not made just on an emotional, I love you, because this emotional, I love you can turn very easily into, I hate you.
Thank you. Igor, is there anything that you would like to add on the subject?
Yes, I would first and foremost, I would really like to strongly support what Nikola said. So, you know, it's not just the problem of the media. It's a problem when the highest officials of this state are actually, you know, sowing distrust into cooperation with NATO, which we demanded actually within the Partnership for Peace. Countries themselves tailor the programs of cooperation with with NATO. So it's not NATO imposing something on us. It's our wish to cooperate because we find opportunities. And then, for example, we had a case. I think it was a former Minister of Defense of Serbia. NATO financed, I think, a facility for destruction of all the ammunition in Serbia, which is an extremely important thing, because we all know that the old ammunition could be dangerous. So, and then in his press statement, he said, sometimes, you know, this is really good. This is something concrete. Sometimes we have certain programs like military drills, etc., which are not always the best or good for us, but this is something concrete and good. So to go back, so basically, Minister said, military exercises and programs that we have with NATO, our army has with NATO, that we chose ourselves, are not good for us. Then why are we doing that? So what I'm trying to say here is that we need more awareness from the elites, that if something is in the interest of Serbia, not to undermine it. So we need actually more honesty here, and more objective behavior, both from the officials and the media. So the goal should not be, as Mr. Rabai said, to entice emotions or radical change of attitudes. It's about realization of what our interests are, what our long-term goals are, and how we can fulfill them, and then certain answers regarding cooperation with NATO, about partnership for peace, about IPAP, would be more obvious than they are now.
Thank you. Marija, since this topic started with you, would you like to close the circle, or there is nothing that you would like to add?
Well, there is nothing special that I would like to add. I would agree on everything that other people said here. I would advocate here once again for professional journalism, and I agree that we are not supposed to report positively or negatively on any topic per se. We should report objectively, and this is the only way we could actually mold public opinion properly. That would be it.
Thank you. I would also like to ask my colleague Milos, is there anything that you would like to say to conclude, or that we can say our thank yous and goodbyes?
Everything I ever thought is mentioned here, so I'm very satisfied with that discussion, and I'm very happy to see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It was lovely to talk to you about this very important topic, and we will see you next week.